Hello, my name is Rob Evans. I'm the School Security Liaison Officer for Vermont's Agency of Education and Department of Public Safety. And I'm here with Miss Emily Harris. She is the Northeast Regional Coordinator for Vermont Emergency Management. And Emily and I have been traveling across the state over the last year as a part of our coordinated effort between the Department of Public Safety and the Agency of Education and our newly established Vermont School Safety Center to do some trainings and awareness opportunities about school crisis planning. And one of the things that we have been hearing is that there is an opportunity to leverage the resources that may or may not be available at the supervisory or district level to assist in individual school emergency preparedness. There is always a power and force multiplying those resources. And so we have developed a training tool to be able to help you and assist you in developing some of those potential resources that are available at the regional level.
And we want to take this opportunity to thank Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union. They were the origin behind this particular document. While we were traveling around, we saw this document and asked if we could borrow it and modify it for use throughout the state. So this document is a planning tool to support you in developing your emergency operations plan throughout the school year. Because the question is, there's a lot you need to do, and so what is the timeline for that? What needs to be accomplished before other things can be worked on? So this document will guide you through that. It'll also discuss the roles and responsibilities of your school crisis team, your public safety team, and your central office. We also have some additional resources in there to help you in that throughout the year.
And Emily, one of the things that I think we continually heard is that individual schools are trying to do a good job at developing their emergency operations plans, but there are combined resources that are available within the supervisory union or the district for transportation, for communication, for incident command, for public information. So there may be an opportunity to share those resources, and this document kind of helps that process along. So, Emily, can you talk a little bit about why folks need to have an emergency operations plan? You hear it for the community, for the emergency management directors, and regionally, and the state obviously has a statewide emergency operations plan. But why is it important for schools to have that?
So first, folks may remember last year a memo came out from the Agency of Education saying that it's a requirement to actually have an emergency operations plan and that you should be working with your local first response organization. So first and foremost is the requirement. Secondly, and actually in my opinion more important, is it's a great idea to know how you're going to respond when some of these big events happen, so you're not trying to make it up in the moment. You know who the players are, what roles they can potentially play, they're trained, and then you guys are having exercises based on that plan to say, can we actually do the things we imagine we would do during an incident? Now, one of the bullets on here is it's important to have an all hazards approach. We know that school shooting is a big hot button item, but that's not one of our more likely things to have happen. So we need to be planning for all hazards that we could potentially face and be focusing on things like communication. Having contact information for all of your staff members is going to be relevant, whether it's a flood, whether it's a tornado, whether it's an active shooter event. That's always a good thing to have.
And Emily, it's a great point. I think it's also important when we're going through the process to train for the things, plan, train, and exercise for the things that we are most likely to be exposed to. And a thing that, when Emily and I go to schools across the state, we're always talking about how many kids each and every day are inside the walls of a school bus, and how many transportation-related issues do we deal with each and every day with kids in our schools. Those are the types of things where there's a higher probability and a chance or a risk associated with something happening. So just make sure that whatever we are most likely to be exposed to, we are dedicating that amount of time for planning, training, and exercising proportionally.
So we also have in there the standard response protocols that are noted throughout the Vermont School Crisis Guide. These are a set of 4 standard responses that you can have regardless of the incident, and we're recommending that schools really push this to their staff and to their students so that when you say lock out, everyone knows what that means. Folks know that if they're outside, they come inside, that no one else is entering the building, that there is something in the community that is causing us to shut our doors and make sure that we're increasing our situational awareness.
And I would also say that if we get that folks may need to add to these processes, but when Emily and I and members of the Vermont School Crisis Planning Team looked at standardized commands, both in the state and nationally, there really wasn't something other than what we are providing here with the standard response protocols that covers the all hazards approach. So there's not one type of incident that you couldn't pigeonhole into one of these types of response processes. So lock down, lock out, evacuate, or shelter, those are the ones that we are committed to providing, and as Emily said, pushing out across the state. I also know that there's a ton of conversations about, well, what do we do on the violent intruder, and moving beyond their traditional lockdown and having conversations about response-based options. And those are all trainings. If you go to the Vermont School Safety Center's website, that's available, and we're having broader conversations statewide about what that means.
And so another document that we've created are emergency response actions. So yes, it talks about the standard response protocols, but it also says that during specific events, there are some modifications you may need to take. So if you're having a flooding event, what you may want to do is you may want to notify on the PA system that everyone is coming inside to shelter in place indoors, and that you may want to be monitoring the National Weather Service. So it's giving you some specifics for those threats and hazards, which leads us into threat and hazard specific guidelines. Because though we're trying to make this all hazard and be increasing our capabilities throughout communication and collaboration, there are specific actions that you may need to take during specific threats and hazards. So within your plan, you should be identifying, if this is a fire, how is this different than if it is a hazmat incident? And so you're identifying those specific actions that may be different.
And Emily, I would say also that it may not be just one response process that you have based upon an incident, that something that's good for one portion of the building may not be so good for what's taking place in another portion of the building. So when we have our response actions based on our threats and hazards, just know that this is a continuum, and it may not just be one response action for the totality of the situation that you're dealing with.
Exactly. And as Rob had mentioned earlier, it's important to collaborate across the supervisory union and with your community partners. One, because they are a resource. So some of your community partners have information about the threats and hazards specific to your area. Also with 211, you can use them to help with public messaging during long-term events. And within your supervisory union, if you have common approaches and common language, you can speak the same language to each other. So schools may be able to share assets and say, we need this school's public information officer to come assist us because we're having a big enough event. So having those trainings be consistent, those roles be consistent, and having that mutual understanding of what other schools are going to do will really help. It also helps specifically when we talk about relocation, so that schools are not all going to the same location if something happens. So you have a collaborative approach in saying, hey, this school will go here, this school will go here, so we've got enough space for everyone, and we're doing this as a unified front.
And making sure that first responders are involved in those conversations as well, because even though we may have an incident-specific situation taking place at one school, it may affect the entire supervisory union. And quite frequently in our conversations across the state, what we are hearing is, we didn't realize that it's the same response resources that are going to the 7 or 8 different schools within that supervisory union. So those resources may be somewhat limited if it's a regional-based emergency or critical incident that we're responding to. So it's helpful for our first responders to understand what our schools are going to be asking for. So they may have to quickly call for mutual aid or get additional state or regional resources flowing in if it's a fairly large incident.
And it's not just the first responders. With the other schools, we found that some schools depend on other schools. So, for example, one school may be depending on another school to take their after-school program. For the high school, they may be the babysitters for the children coming out of the elementary school. So there's a lot of dependencies between the schools. So making sure that the supervisory union level, they're informed when something is happening so that they can be informing the other schools, and the other schools can start planning for their response.
And I think it's also critically important that for our privates and our independent schools that are inside those areas where our supervisory unions are located, to make sure that they are at least aware of the planning process, so that the areas that they are picking for their relocation and family reunification sites aren't the same or are different than those that you're asking for as well.
So one of the things that we've done with this checklist is we've really broken it down into a couple of month periods and then gone over some key things that you should be working on that month. So for September and October, the main thing is you want to be forming your school crisis team, making sure that you have members that are going to be coming throughout the year to help you update your plans and do your trainings and exercising, and that you've got contact information for your school staff, your support community partners, as well as your students.
And I would say that the updating of the information is critical, because we understand completely that there's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of folks that are leaving positions and moving into others. That beginning of the year, September, October, and I would say maybe even push that back to the August time frame for prior to the start of the school year, that information hasn't changed. If you've got existing plans, this is the time to just go back and do a quality control check to make sure that we're on board with those types of things. It's also an opportunity to take a look at and try to identify those threats and vulnerabilities that may take place during your school year. And Emily, can you talk a little bit about where folks can get resources through the EMD or the LEPC about and define what those organizations are for that hazard and threat and vulnerability assessment?
So yes, every town has what's called an emergency management director or an EMD. If they don't have one, it's actually the select board. And every town also has something called a hazard mitigation plan. This plan lasts for 5 years and identifies historic as well as additional information about what hazards exist in our community and how are we going to mitigate those hazards. But that source of information is really good for our schools to know, because a lot of the legwork is already done about what has historically happened in this area, what are we expecting to happen in the future. And Rob had mentioned LEPCs, that's the Local Emergency Planning Committee. That is a congregation of the EMDs as well as your hazardous chemical facilities coming together on a regular basis to discuss how, as a community, it's roughly county boundaries, it's a little bit different, but how as a community you're going to respond to hazardous materials incidents. So if you're nearby a hazardous material generating facility, it may be good for you to go to these local emergency planning committee meetings to figure out how the community is going to respond to this, and maybe where you should be evacuating through, so you're not, say, going through the plume or going to the area that the town shelter is going to be at. So having those conversations ahead of time so that you're prepared when something happens is really important.
And just pay particular attention to the individual school crisis team, and that's specific to the school, and then the public safety team, which is more of a regional based team, and fully understanding that. Let's say we're talking about a supervisory union in the northwest corner of the state. Individual schools may be getting a little bit frustrated with a lack of what seems to be a lack of participation from local first response folks that can't attend each individual school's school crisis team meetings. The leveraging and the power and the force multiplying that can take place at the public safety team level is those are regional based resources that can be applied so that folks can attend one meeting but get the full scope and understanding of what's taking place regionally. So that's where we're bringing in and folding in our supervisory union and district level resources.
So in November through February, you want to make sure that you're making those connections with first responders. So though they may not be able to attend every one of your school crisis team meetings, you want to be having conversations with them on a regular basis through the phone to just say, hey, here's where we are in our planning process. Hey, we're having an exercise we'd like to invite you to. So those sorts of informal conversations throughout November and February are really important, because you don't want to be meeting your local police chief for the first time when you need him during an incident. You want to know and have a relationship with that person ahead of time. You also want to be having scenario discussions. So as we discussed previously, you have different threats and hazards that are facing your school. So you want to be having conversations about how our response may change for these different threats and hazards. And you want to be communicating that information with your parents. So at the beginning of the school year, you may have sent them out a flyer to advise them, stay at home, don't come to the school during an incident. But during November and February, you want to be revisiting those conversations through a newsletter or through just conversations at regular meetings to say, hey, we're just reaffirming with you that if something is happening at the school, it will harm our response to have you show up. You need to wait until we contact you, and here's the way we're going to contact you. So continuing those conversations is really important.
And don't forget about the available training and support that's available for you at the Vermont School Safety Center's website. There's just a ton of resources that are already plated up. If it's the What If Wednesdays or the facilitated dialogues that we have here, a lot of that information is available for you already, and there is no lift required to get these types of trainings available when you do get your school crisis teams together.
That's a great point, Rob. And one of the resources that's available on there are these facilitated dialogues. They're like a little discussion-based exercise where you're given a scenario and you're asked to walk through what you would do in response to that scenario and answer a series of questions. And those are an excellent resource to be using through these November and February months.
And I would say once it's a building block approach with this process. Once we're feeling comfortable with this, and maybe we have done a tabletop, there are some fantastic exercise planning and implementation resources available, through Emily and others within Vermont Emergency Management, that if we're going to step up and get a little bit more aggressive and more in depth with our exercises, these folks and subject matter experts can walk you through the process and how doing a functional or a full-scale exercise where we're bringing all of the moving pieces together to aggressively go out and train and revise and exercise our plans with that. And other than your participation, there really isn't a lot of requirements locally. These folks will come in, they will prepare and plan the exercise for you, provide the facilitators, as well as do a lot of the evaluation for you as well.
The only thing to note is that you will need to help us with the planning. So these facilitated dialogues that are available online are just a quick, you look at them, you do them. However, when we get into these larger exercises, we do need a commitment from the schools to be participating in that planning process, because you guys actually know your plans. I don't know your particular plan. And so to figure out what it is that we're testing and how we're going to do that, excuse me, it's very important to be involved in that.
And Emily,
process.
I would say that too, just in the planning of the exercise, there's learning opportunities with that as well. When we're going through our plans and seeing what we have and that type, it's not just the exercise. There's just as much value in the planning of the exercise as well.
And then at the conclusion of any one of those exercises, you'll be provided with a report to say what went well and what didn't go well and where you should be working towards to improve your response in the future. So then we get into the March and the June months. I know we start thinking about the end of the school year, but there are still some things that we need to be working on. One of them is go for a visit to your evacuation site. Verify that that evacuation site is actually still a good place to go. That in one example, I was working with a school where their evacuation site had actually been sold in the previous months, and they didn't know it until they went to go visit that site. So check that site, make sure that it's still sufficient for your needs. Make sure to update any mutual aid agreement that you have with them, a memorandum of understanding with that site to say, hey, we're going to be going to your site, we agree to this, here's who's providing maintenance to that site if we go there, here's who's going to plow the driveway if needed, here's who's going to clean up after the fact. So coming to an agreement ahead of time to say, hey, here's what it looks like, and we both agree that this is what it's going to look like.
And Emily, I would say that we understand completely that we are at different levels of our preparedness across the state. There are some folks in their supervisory union or district levels that may have this already well in place. There are others that this is the first time that they're hearing that this is where they should be heading to on the supervisory union or district level. So if it's new for you, don't be overwhelmed. If it's already in place, then just use this as an additional planning template. But these are the conversations that all schools should be having at the regional and district level to make sure that we're heavily involved in our emergency preparedness efforts.
Yeah. And I will say that we're actually here to help. So if you have any questions, do reach out to Rob or myself by email, by phone number. Do visit the School Safety Center website, which is at the bottom of your screen now. And you'll also notice that we've got members of the school crisis planning team on the side. So this is the state level team that works to create some of these resources for you. So if you have particular questions for particular organizations, it gives you a starting place. So if you have some questions about mental health, you might want to reach out to Charlotte McCorkle, who represents mental health on this team. So it's a good resource, and I advise everyone to go take a look.
Thanks, folks, for your participation. And again, as Emily said, if you have any questions specifically about this training, you can contact me or Emily at Vermont Emergency Management at the contact information below. Thank you.